Okay, so thanks for being patient, everyone. So we will begin this session over the next 40 minutes or so, and I'll try and allow some time for questions and answers. If anyone does have any, they can put them in the chat box, or they can flag up and raise their hand, so we can do it that way. We've started this about a month ago, and we were speaking about the basics of process validation, and we had that overview on the 24th of September. Today we're going to be talking about qualification, IQ, OQ, PQ, and really what you need to know about equipment qualifications in general. The packaging validation we will look at in the next month, and we will also be combining that with looking at statistical sampling plans, and also sterilization validation will be combined with that session. So quite a lot to go through on the next session, with an aim to try and wrap up this validation program by the 10th of December. We will also be looking at equipment software validation in further detail. I will be talking a little bit about equipment software validation in this session, but it will be focusing on general qualifications. We will be looking at some of the approaches from various other guidance documents that are available, such as the FDA and also GAMP, Good Automated Manufacturing Practice. And then that will then hand us over to the new year. We will be looking at further topics over and above validation. So without further ado, I will move on. So we're going to be looking at some of these elements of validation. The URS, the first point of contact into the validation process, the user requirement specification, then the factory acceptance tests, site acceptance tests, design validation, qualification, which is the heart of the process, IQ, OQ, PQ, and then also generally process validation. So to begin with, really we want to be looking at the user requirement specification as the document that will ensure that you receive what you want. So whether that's a piece of equipment, whether that's a process, whether it's a system, it can be anything within the site. You've got to go through these qualification stages, which we will be talking about over the next 40 minutes or so. But the user requirement specification is the starting point that you want to be beginning at for your project initiation. It's always a starting point of good validation, and it also gives you the opportunity to ensure that when you're doing your factory acceptance testing, that you have some form of functional specification which begins with the user requirement specification, which goes to the supplier, and the supplier would then respond back from your user requirement specification saying that you've asked for the following things and we will supply you this in the following manner. And that then gives you an opportunity to check that functional specification to ensure before the build or commissioning takes place, whether it's a piece of equipment, system, or facility. It can even be a clean room, for instance, that also needs to have qualification and sterilization validation done. Then that user requirement specification will give them all of that detail. Now, you're probably wondering a bit more, what does that then look like? So I'm going to put this into a very basic perspective in terms of a case scenario. If you were to purchase a car, you would be thinking about some of these things before you make that purchase, whether you want, what type of fuel you want in the car. Is it a diesel, petrol, electric vehicle, or a hybrid? What sort of budget you want to spend? Do you have any color preferences, interior and exterior? Do you have a make and model preference? Any technical specifications which might be to do with the performance, the speed, the efficiency? What comfort levels do you want? Do you want leather seats, fabric, size, boot space, appearance, running costs, maintenance parts, all these things? The list can go on and on and on, but this just puts it into a very simple perspective of something that you and I can all appreciate when we're purchasing something which is meaningful to us. And that could also be a house, a car, anything that you want. that you would be thinking of as requirements that you would want to have. So within a typical contents of a user requirement specification, you might also be looking at things like management requirements, operational requirements, and equipment requirements or topics. So such as you might then put an introduction and identification of the organization's goals, expected benefits, budgets, resources, time, security, procedural and maintenance constraints, any existing infrastructure, policies and practices. These are things to think about: contracts and service agreements. And then also looking at operational topics, what the intended equipment usage is. Is it going to be used for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days in a year? You need to start thinking about maintenance. You need to think about breakdown, planned equipment downtime and unplanned equipment downtime. All of these sort of things come into it. Then you also have things like mean time between failure. So going into sort of very traditional engineering practices, profiles of users, what sort of users will be utilizing the equipment, what modes of operation. Is it going to be a semi-automated piece of equipment, or is it fully automated, or is it manual? What are the desired functionalities? So these are all the high-level operational topics, and then when it gets down to the equipment, you're going to be looking at far more detail than this. You're going to be looking at what production and quality performance you want the machine to be achieving, what sort of yield is acceptable. These are the sort of things that very often can be overlooked. And I have to say that user requirement specification on a whole is very often overlooked, because the number of projects that I get involved in where equipment needs to be validated has no history of any user requirement specification that you're trying to then match up a qualification exercise that needs to be executed. Typically, you would be looking at the user requirements, especially for something like a performance qualification. When we get to PQ, we'll be looking at some of the things that you need to consider, which would have been usually identified in the user requirement specification had it been done properly. And I'm saying that because very often what happens is a piece of equipment may be lying in the factory shop floor. It's been used and it's been in operation for X number of years, but there was no validation done on it. So then when you get into the weeds of the validation, you need to start looking at any documentation which was existing prior to the qualification being done. And sometimes the user requirement specification ends up being a communication between the customer and the supplier. That might even be emails. So there may even be a phone call conversation, but the minimum that we can go off is any documented records, and that might be an email which gives us some evidence of what was being requested at the time of purchase. So this is assuming everything's done in the right order. So things that are often going wrong, as I said, equipment is not delivered correctly because it wasn't discussed. And as I said, having a URS is your insurance policy to ensure that what you are receiving, what's being delivered, is in fact correct against the user requirement specification, because you want to be using it almost as a checklist. Is this what we requested? The equipment uses too much energy. We didn't ask for that in the inputs. The equipment is too slow. Well, you didn't say how fast you wanted to run, or the opposite. The door opens from the wrong side. Well, you didn't say which side. So this is the level of granular detail that we need to try and achieve in a user requirement specification, because it will become that document that even in a legal situation you can go back on. And nobody wants to be in a situation where that happens, but it does happen. And you want to make sure that the supplier has in fact given you what you requested. So further on from that, once we get a satisfactory communication between the supplier and yourselves of what you're looking for as the customer, we would then typically be looking at doing the factory acceptance testing. And again, they would be based on contractual arrangements, specifications, and it would proceed, as I said, from the URS of what the testing, what is being requested and what challenge testing you have to provide, and what your what stress testing you may perform on the equipment itself. So it would become then a prescription of tests that will be performed to challenge the system, the process of the equipment, and usually it's the last chance to get things right before the equipment arrives on site. So this is where you would, at the supplier site, ensure that you've got factory acceptance tests done before it gets shipped to your own site. The next stage would be site acceptance testing. Once we will look at that in the coming slides. You will do the site acceptance testing at your site, then once it arrives. So this is a really staged process. Before we actually get into the heart of the qualification, before we get anywhere near installation qualification, we're looking at ensuring that the equipment is going to arrive and it's as we requested, and we've done some level of testing at the supplier site. And it even can be things like dimensional checks to make sure that it's going to arrive in a crate at your site protected, and it's going to be shipped. The adequate packaging and the protection before it arrives in your site. So here, when we get to the factory acceptance test, you will have that checklist, and that could be a general inspection checklist, but you will also have your machine safety and functionality inspection checklist, machine component inspection checklist, and you would also typically run some level of samples through the equipment and have the acceptance criteria, and you would know at that point what the acceptance criteria is. Depending on the piece of equipment, if it's customized and tailor-made to your requirements, of course it's not off the shelf, and that's where the user requirement becomes even more important at that point, and that's where the checklist that you have will also become more detailed and granular at the factory acceptance point. You would also work with the commissioning company to establish some level of acceptance criteria. It may be something that you're familiar with, where you've already established limits. You know what the pass-fail criteria is. So this is really, really important. You're going to have some situation where you might involve doing destructive testing. So the samples that you put through the equipment, you will never be able to recover again. So you have to factor in costs of destroying product, which might be good product, it could be expensive product, but it's got to be an adequate amount that gives you the satisfaction that you are okay to now receive the equipment at your site. So only once we've achieved that satisfaction would we checklist off everything and say, right, we're good to go. You can now ship this to our site and we're ready to receive this. So now we get to the site acceptance test. So it's been agreed. We've got the ultimate sign-off stage. We've got the sign-off at the factory acceptance, and now we're ready to sign off the site acceptance. And the site acceptance would be done at your site, not the supplier. It's the last step before the official qualification process begins. And also this depends on the complexity and the cost and time. But one of the things to also bear in mind is for anyone here that's in a management situation, you've also got to think about budgets. And when you've got a contract with a supplier supplying you a piece of equipment or the clean room or whatever it is, in the contract you would put down staged payments. And the staged payments would also be linked with acceptance or satisfactory acceptance at the different stages. So you might have 50% upfront, 20% upon factory acceptance. You might have another, and the remaining 30% could be at site acceptance, because like I said, the site acceptance is the last step, and usually you would be expected to pay the full amount by that point, because now this is the point where we're about to enter into the qualification stages. So here, when we get into the qualification, we're going to start looking at the IQ, OQ, and PQ. Installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification of the system, process, equipment, etc., whatever it is that you are qualifying. It's absolutely fundamental to success. It's a tried and tested model based on logic, and it must be sequential. So you wouldn't do the PQ before the OQ and the OQ before the IQ, and vice versa, etc. So installation qualification, which will go on to the second, was you installing the equipment, and then operationally checking the equipment, and then performance checking it for consistency. That's been done over and over with success. So it's not something that we want to try and revise. And I will come on to this in a few minutes. There's also the opportunity to combine some of these stages. So you might combine an IQ, OQ, PQ all together. You might combine the OQ and the PQ and have the IQ separate. So there's different ways of this to be done, but this all has to be based on an impact and risk assessment, which we will discuss. So as I said, the installation qualification, you're looking at the level of checking which is required for the machine which is being installed or needs installing, which would be a number of checks which will be done prior to commencing onto the OQ. Before we get to the operational qualification, we'll look at contents in the next slide. Operational qualification would then be looking at, after the installation has been done successfully, we would then go to look at establishing parameters and checking for its extreme limits, and that's when we would be stress testing the equipment. We would also be looking at functional testing to make sure that everything is functionally testing as intended. And this is almost, some of this is a repeat of what would be done at the factory acceptance, but in a lot more detail, in a lot more depth. You would be doing the operational qualification checks. And then once we've got satisfactory PQ, we would then be OQ, we would then be moving on to PQ, the performance qualification. We would then, by this point, we should have established what the nominal parameters is. So you can look at it in this way, that the operational qualification actually does give you some opportunity to do some design of experiments where you can run orthogonal arrays or other methods. Some people are familiar with Taguchi methods or any of the other lean techniques, that you would want to be looking at the equipment to be leaned out as much as possible, where you can apply a statistically tightly controlled process. And by doing that, you would be eliminating as much defect where possible and looking at a higher yield as much as possible. So that's all going to be established before you get to PQ, because really when you get to the performance qualification, you want to be running at normal running parameters of what you would run the machine at in a normal operation. When you get to the normal operation environment, you want to be running it in the normal environment and normal conditions, and there wouldn't be any stress testing at that point. We've got beyond that stress test, and we would be then looking for consistency and repeatability within the equipment. So they should be, you can run statistics on this, of course, and although we're not intending to look at the statistics and the sampling plans today, but there are some things that we will have to look at in this presentation. So then, typical contents of an IQ, when you write the installation qualification protocol, you would be looking at the equipment description, any reference numbers, serial numbers, model numbers. You would be looking at basic mechanical and electrical checks. Has the equipment been wired in correctly with the correct voltage, whether it's a phase 3 or any other requirements for electrical requirements. It could even be for running off compressed air. So if you're running anything which has pressure that needs compressed air, and that can also vary as well, because you might have air that's got to be breathable air, and there's also ISO standards for that as well, for medical device requirements that has air that you might be using to to blow onto medical devices, to clean medical devices. And I've had that situation before where we had a Class 3 medical device which was being manufactured in a highly controlled clean room. Now, I can't remember the actual classification of it, would have been highly classified. And they were using compressed air from a compressor, which there are air particles, particulates from the oil that can also then trickle on to the device if you're blowing onto the device for using for cleaning purposes. And under those circumstances, if you've got this is in the case where we had a hernia implant, and you can imagine that's highly critical, and the particulates have to be filtered. So we had to apply an ISO standard for the compressed air. So there's a requirement for that as well. You might also have water, maintenance and calibration checks, critical components you've got to check for. Also checking at this point for the availability of software. So is there software that the equipment is using to run the equipment, and whether if it's automated, then we're going to start looking at principles such as GAMP. Documentation review, manuals, any procedures that you need to have, any other documentation that you need to have, work instructions at this point. Health and safety checks. Now, there are lots of standards. You have to follow electrical directives and any other safety checks and any other safety standards. Now, larger organizations usually have some form of health and safety representative that would do some form of perhaps zero guarding, making sure that you can't get your fingers trapped in anything. So you've also got to make sure that guarding is available within equipment to ensure that it's safeguarding for any hazards. And of course, there's you could do a hazard analysis, of course. So that's one of the things that larger companies will also be involved in as well, doing a hazard or applying typical principles to ensure that health and safety is in place. So once we've got the IQ, we look onto the OQ, typical contents of an operational qualification. You're looking at operational tests, what tests need to be done to stress test, product challenges, what product challenges are needed, cleaning verification that we need to clean down the machine, and then also reviewing SOPs and training. Does anyone need to be involved? What do they have adequate training to perform even the operational qualification? Any testing that's being done, we might need operators that have been familiar with this type of process before, and obviously establishing acceptance criteria. What is good and bad? It's all fair and well writing tests and everything, but if you don't know the difference between a good and a bad, it's really not going to be much use. So some of the things that we'll be looking at, typical contents of a performance qualification, you might be looking, there's obviously good documentation practice that must be followed. We have to review for completeness, ensuring that from batch to batch, there's documentation that have been following good documentation practice, signatures, line clearance, startup checklists, in-process checks, other documentation that might be needed that's also attached, comments that are traceable. So these are typical audit trail type of checkpoints that we look for in a typical pass-fail type of format. You'd also be looking at things like labels, legibility of entries, customer complaints, that there may be something to do with the batch that you're actually doing a performance qualification, because we don't just do performance qualifications for new equipment. You might actually be doing it because of a customer complaint that we might need to, you may, for instance, change something in an existing equipment that's already been validated and already been qualified that you've made a change to. And that's where your CAPAs, your deviations, non-conformances that have been raised, you would then be revalidating. So there is also an audit trail and traceability requirement for that as well. Any stoppages, they could also be reported, a line log. These are very good. These are good practice initiatives that you should have regardless. So I'm going to now look at GAMP. So GAMP versus a least burdensome approach, because if anybody's familiar with GAMP, it can be a very, very onerous process. And I've had lots of organizations completely scared away by looking at validation because of the amount of paperwork involved, because of the requirements of GAMP. Now, GAMP is good automated manufacturing practice, and they typically have these 4 different categories. There used to be 5, and don't ask me why they didn't renumber the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. They just removed number 2, which was firmware. So that if you had any firmware which was running the equipment, that would typically be reviewed as part of the GAMP impact assessment. But the GAMP 5, which was the latest revision, they removed firmware, which was category 2. So you've only got 1, 3, 4, and 5. So 1 is your operating systems, typically things like Windows and Linux. 3, you've got your standard software packages, which are commercially available off the shelf. Statistical analysis packages, any software with HPLC, laboratory instruments. And then you've got the third category, category 4, which is configurable software packages, providing standard interfaces like SCADA, LIMS, ERP packages, those type of things. And then you've got the final one, which is customized bespoke software, which has been built specifically to run a piece of equipment, such as a CIP, a clean in place, heavily automated systems. Now, if you do have a say in how the equipment is being built, you want to try and have it as standard and away from custom as possible, because that's when you're getting involved into coding. And as I said, there's going to be a separate session which we'll be looking at software validation, but this is when we get into what we would call white box testing. And in other cases, we would be looking at black box testing. So black box testing typically would be testing the inputs and the outputs rather than looking at the code itself. And that's what you have to do when you've got into the realms of bespoke software. So this is a flowchart which I use in a lot of my procedures for medical device process manufacturers. So we've got the 4 categories here. So will it be applied to a medical device intended for clinical safety studies? Yes, no. And we'll look at these. What does 1, 2, and 3 mean? So this is moving away from a traditional GAMP approach. And this is what I mean by a least burdensome approach, because it's putting less burden on the manufacturer to try and look at a more smarter way of compliance to ensure that you're validating and doing a risk assessment and impact assessment on your software, which is running the equipment, but also looking at GAMP principles. If you look at GAMP principles, you would end up doing a functional design specification, a functional specification, and design specification, and lots of other specification documents, almost regardless, because it doesn't, unfortunately, give you so much leeway to not do the documents if it fits into especially category 3 or category 4. So we want to be looking at this as more of a pragmatic way of doing things. So what this will mean, for example, is if you have a new system and you're following a risk-based approach, this table here, which I use in my processes, would mean if you were a system category 1, so if I flick back to this, which means does it have software? No, but is it standard off the shelf to be applied? That means if the answer is no, then that basically means that you've got a higher risk equipment and you've got to do the full suite of documentation, which would be checking to ensure that there's maintenance calibration, that you've done a URS. You would also do design qualification. I know we didn't really talk about design qualification, but this is the same as the functional specification, which the manufacturers of the equipment would supply you with. And then factory acceptance, which is to be assessed case by case. And then you might also have the site acceptance there as well. And then you get into the IQ, OQ, PQ. There may be circumstances where you can't do a PQ, and I'll come on to that later on. And then if you've got a category 2, where you wouldn't be a design qualification, the factory acceptance, that's probably something that's off the shelf. So you wouldn't have it customized for you. So you would go straight into, from a URS, you would go straight into the qualification. And then the least riskiest would be with something that you would just have off the shelf, and you would not, there would be no validation required, and you would just do maintenance calibration. That could be something like weighing scales or vernier calipers or something like that, which again, it depends on the intended use, because weighing scales can also go through qualification depending on its use. And I've been involved in pharmaceutical grade weighing scales, which even a milligram can have a massive effect on active ingredients. So obviously that is a big factor. So this also links back to the flow chart. So we've got categories A, B, C, D, and E. So I'm just going to flip back to this. So here we've got A, B, C, D, and E. So when we get to E, that's where we've already categorized the GAMP categories, whether it's a 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, or 5. And then we would go through a critical assessment. And at that point, and I'll show you what the critical assessment looks like, and that's where you would have no additional controls required if it's a low risk, but if it's a high risk, then you would have to have some level of additional control. So as I said here earlier on, if you go anywhere near bespoke systems, then you're going to have full validation, including source code review, and that's what you've got, what we would call white code testing, white box testing. So here what we're saying is, if the system is not intended to be applied to the manufactured medical device, which is intended for the use of a clinical or safety study, where the principles of GMP are requirements, the systems is designated as a category 3. So that's where minimum, so that's where you do your calibration and preventive maintenance. So there's no validation at that point. Then if the system has some software computerized element, that's where you've got to categorize, and that's when we look at steps D and E in a second. And we've got to do a gap, an impact assessment, and then a system that is not category 3 but is deemed to be off the shelf. It may be designated as a category 3, where you do your URS, IQ, OQ as a minimum. No DQ is required because you're not having it designed specially for you. It's off the shelf. And then you would be performing a performance qualification, and then you would make a decision based on a system-specific basis. And then when we get on to going back to the diagram D, we're looking at categorizing the GAMP guidelines, because at this point we've answered yes, that it does have software. So at this point, this is when we're looking at the GAMP guidelines, and we're looking at the definitions, whether it's going to need to have further work done on it. So the upshot of this will be that you will have to do, if it's a high-risk software, then the minimum that you should do is data backup. You should be looking at risk prevention strategies. You should be looking at password protection, disaster recovery, to make sure that the equipment still operates after a severe disaster that's occurred. That could be power outages or anything like that. And then outputs, which would be challenged, which is the main bulk of the testing, which is the black box, ensuring the functionality of the system meets predetermined inputs and expected results. And then obviously we would also be looking at filling out a form. So you should have a typical form that would be a question-based assessment. So when you're doing your data criticality, you look at your software criticality, you look at data criticality, you would look at probability of risk, you look at probability of detection, and you would and this is where it differs from GAMP, because GAMP will go into a lot more complicated assessment, and what I've tried to do here is adopt a much more pragmatic approach, where I'm looking at a low and a high risk. So they're looking at the risk of the data, if it's low or high, and then the probability of the risk, whether it's low or high, and then the probability of detection, whether it's low or high. And then what you would do is you would then have an aggregate risk, which you would compute the three, anything which is a high. So you would have an aggregate risk. If all factors are high, then the aggregate risk is high, and so forth. So the last one being low on all accounts, So that, I think that's a mistake actually. That should be high. That's an error. So because this one is the probability of detection, which the point here is if you have a high probability of detection, that's going to reflect a low risk. And a low probability of detection reflects a high risk. So for example, in detection, this is an example that is giving you about detection here. So if you've got no screen warning, but a query or report results in obviously wrong, other processes will eventually pick up the errors, and then application self-checking cannot continue processing. That's where you've got a low risk. But then on the other hand, if you've got something flagging up which shows and detects something that's going wrong, that's a lower risk. So that's why that should be high. That's an error in this. I'll correct this. So overall aggregate risk would be low in this circumstance. So what we're looking at is once we do an impact assessment, we want to see whether the aggregate risk is going to be high or low. And based on that, that's what we would then decide our outcome of the workload that needs to be done. So this is where this system here, the high risk system, you would be doing the following amount of testing. So that's where you've got to make sure you've got your black box testing done as well. So we'll look at from a procedure level, when you're documenting IQ, OQ, and PQ, you need to make sure that you've covered all the necessary descriptions, the identifications. OQ, you've also got to be having a look at these descriptions, these headers, the purposes, and then identifications, the critical parameters, material variability, product characteristics, worst case, high and low settings. These are all things that you need to think about when you're writing these documents. I'm just conscious about time, so I'm just going to move on a bit quickly. Still a fair bit to cover. So when we get to the process validation, when you do your PQ, then you've also got to make sure that you've got descriptions and identifications like precursors, challenges, environmental conditions, the number of batches, settings, what nominal settings might be, process characteristics, sampling and test plan, and impact on product, and all the rest of that. You should also always make sure that you've got a master validation plan and a master validation plan report that's being written up that would document all the work that needs to be done within the site that needs to be maintained. And you might have on a high level a director for process validation as well, depending on the size of the company. For most startups, I would make sure that there's at least one process validation procedure that meets the requirements of ISO 13485. However, if you've got a much larger organization and a lot of equipment, you might also have a directive at a higher level to make sure that you're also looking at things like deviations and non-conformances and making sure that you've got the validated state is maintained. Pre-qualification, revalidation, IQ, OQ, and PQ. And of course, you can combine this all into one procedure. You don't have to have directives, but then you might also have material supply and process evaluation qualification. If you're doing material qualification for lots of processes, let's say, for example, you've got injection molding machines or extrusion machines, and there's lots of polymers involved, you've got to then go through material suitability, and then looking at all sorts of complexities that might be involved in material supply as well. So the impact assessment that I talked about earlier on, for some reason this should have been earlier on, this looking at identifying the system and then developing system boundaries. Does the system have a direct impact on product quality? Yes or no? So if it has a direct impact on product quality, we would define this, and this is a definition from GAMP. In fact, it would be a direct impact system. And if it is not, if the system is linked to a direct impact system, then it's going to be an indirect impact system. And then if it's not a direct or indirect impact system, then it's no impact, then it's no impact, and then you're just going to develop a rationale depending on which way the equipment impacts product quality, because that's the heart of the decision of a lot of things based on risk will be its impact on product quality. So when we're looking at process validation, we talked about process validation in the last session. For those who had joined the last session, you're looking at the entire process from incoming goods to finished goods. You're looking at establishing confidence, that the process is effective and reproducible. You're also looking at making sure that you're following guidelines, looking at guidelines and such as the FDA principles. There's all sorts of other useful guidelines. There's the process validation, also guideline from the FDA, and I will annotate some of these later on with some of the guidance documents that you can use in addition to the GAMP the guidelines. And then three consecutive batches. Everybody talks about three. Why three? Some people like to quote first is chance, second is risk, and third is validation. Some say it's taking more of a risk-based approach. So when you're developing your protocols, generally making sure that you've got standardization across the protocols, that you've got your text, font size, formatting, footers. That obviously speeds up protocol writing. You can use templates, combine protocols, like I said earlier on. So you can combine maybe IQ and OQ into your IQ OQ. You might combine IQ OQ and PQ into one IQ OQ PQ. You might combine IQ and PQ into an installation, qualification, and a performance. So that's omitting the OQ at this point. That might be because you've moved a piece of equipment somewhere. So it's not necessarily changed the functionality, but you want to make sure that the equipment still operates after installing it in a different place. That's where you would perform a performance qualification and ensure that it still runs as it did in the previous location. So that's the reason why there's no OQ. So definitely there is opportunity to combine, and there's different ways of combining, but you have to have a look at the risks of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So this is just a typical way of protocol preparation. Most people have got some template of protocol that they're using. You've got the body of the document, the head of the body of the document, and the footer. And then you're making sure that you've got all the necessary information, key information, et cetera, that needs to be developed. And then, of course, the acceptance criteria has to be completely clear. Language should be unambiguous, clear, so an auditor will understand simple and factually. Read it over and over again. Get it right first time. Always use good documentation practice or good manufacturing practice. Use blue or black ink. Never mix it. Use good documentation practice. So if you had any errors, single line deletion, initial and date, all the rest of the good things. For report writing, always ensure you're following the protocol against the report. So as an auditor or somebody that reviews a lot of validations, I will want to have a look at the protocol alongside the report to make sure that the protocol was followed. And very often the protocol is the same document as the report. So people will use a protocol which will be, I'll have placeholder for documentation. It will have the tests, and then the script will be then executed, and then it will be written into usually by hand and then signed off. That's obviously an old-fashioned way of doing things. There's lots of automated practices now, even within validation. I'm a bit old school, so I still tend to use a lot of the old processes and manual processes and this way of doing things. But like I said, if you've got an automated software which is doing validation, guess what? That also needs to be validated. So no surprises with that one. So the thing is that you introduce any system into the process which has a level of automation that also needs to be validated. So just continuing on from there, be consistent with language. Don't enter not applicable if you don't mean it. Make sure all explanations are given with an asterisk or similar. Allow for comments. Initial and date each form. Always ensure performed by tests are verified by, so you should have verification by somebody. So that's somebody making sure that you're checking your work and before it actually goes for sign off. Again, using good documentation practice, 9 and not 9, whichever way you write it, it needs to be consistent, and you make it numerical if it's numerical. If you've got discrepancies, make sure they've been addressed. If you've got failures, go back and retest to make sure that you've got the acceptance criteria passed. And if you've got a situation where the acceptance criteria is not passed, you need to have a good rationale for accepting the equipment to be fully qualified with failures. So key points to take away for protocol writing, report and writing. Report should be signed by the same signatories as the protocol. The protocol should be available with the report for the reviewer. All tests and acceptance and protocol criteria must be met. If acceptance criteria is not met, write a deviation and non-conformance. So pre-qualification, some of the things that you should do before in terms of preparation is prior to the actual execution, pre-checking all critical acceptance criteria, ensure formal validation will not fail. So the thing is that before you actually get into formal qualification, you can do dummy runs. And this is what I meant earlier on by design of experiments and doing some level of testing and making sure that you've done it all correct. It doesn't need to be formal. You can do all your planning. You need to make sure that you've got your planning when you actually get to your qualification. Do you have operator support? Do you have engineering technicians that will assist you? Do you have the materials? Is the protocol signed off? Have you got tick all of the boxes that are prerequisites for actually doing the qualification? So when we get to the qualification, it's not the time for optimizing parameters unless you do an optimization qualification, not an operational qualification, because that can be mixing up terms. And that's been done. You know, there's no problem in doing that. You can do an optimization qualification. And then also validation is not the time to find maintenance problems, although it often is an area where it highlights lots of issues, and that's why there's lots of benefits of doing qualification. When you're executing the protocol, make sure that you've got witnesses, compare the actual results, document the testing, and then also making sure that you've got an observer and a scientist. And then, like I said before, other people should be able to follow your work. It should be completely legible and understandable. Read and follow the protocol. If in doubt, ask, be thorough, and be organized. You know, it's one of the key things about a successful qualification is being organized, and you might want to apply something like the 5S principles, or in the West, it's very often known as the can-do principles: clean, arrange, neat, discipline, and organization or orderliness. So good planning, you know, making sure that you've got everything in advance. Do you have the necessary calibrated tests, trained operators, PPE? The appropriate SOPs and the parameter sheets. Other points to consider: you don't do execution from the desk. I do a lot of remote working, so I write up a lot of protocols. I review and approve a lot of documents, validation documents. But what I don't do is I don't execute a validation from the desk, which is practically impossible unless you're doing software validation, which is you're accessing something from the cloud or that type of thing, which is a different thing, which we will, as I said, when we get to software qualification, validation, we will be discussing some of that. Protecting documentation, attaching in any labels or raw data, preparing samples, and then also making sure that you've got the integrity of original data, showing calculations, no transcribing, complete all attachments, and making it all completely clear. And then a test should be executed ideally by 2 people, prevents forgery, good health and safety practice. If you've got a situation which could be a health and safety issue, sometimes simply that's the only way that you cannot do validation by yourself. And then you also need to allow time between runs, data review, assembly data, preparing for next runs, conducting investigations, implementing corrective actions, and also performing additional testing. So if you have deviations at any point, that's obviously something that an auditor wants to see during an audit trail to support any conclusions. Deviation doesn't always mean a validation failure. It just means that you said something at the beginning and you didn't do it that way, so you've got to justify the reason for that. And then again, if you don't close that deviation, then you've got to take a risk-based approach, resolve deviations and address corrective actions, and then follow them up. So these are all typical things in an audit trail. So to summarize, be thorough when you're doing your qualification, when you're doing your IQ, OQ, PQ. All manufacturing and test equipment manufacturers can ensure that the devices consistently meet safety standards and specifications. When clearly defined, the equipment qualification, that will ensure that your machine or system or whatever you're qualifying meets the intended functions consistently, minimizing variations in the production process. And it also helps identify and mitigate potential risks related to equipment failure malfunction, which could lead to product defects, contamination, system breakdowns. And then the documentation also ensures that we have a clear audit trail for internal quality audits. So I'm just wrapping up now. So that's